David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. I shall deal with David Copperfield in two parts. This section will comprise of life and literary career of Charles Dickens and a brief outline of the novel David Copperfield. In section 2, I shall deal with the autobiographical elements in the novel and analyze some of the major characters. First, life and literary career of Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, or Charles John Huffam Dickens, the most outstanding novelist in English literature, was also the most popular and influential writer of his time. His works have continued to be read with great admiration by a wide reading public till today. He shares this distinction of being a very great and popular writer with Shakespeare. Charles Dickens was born to John and Elizabeth Dickens at Landport, Portsmouth on 7th February 1812. His father was a clerk in the pay department in the Navy office there. He was a well-meaning but irresponsible man and very bad at managing money. When the family moved to London, their money problems resulted in his father's imprisonment for debt in the Marshalsea prison. At the age of 12, Dickens had to leave his school. He was sent to work in a factory away from home. This was a traumatic experience which left deep scars on his psyche. Bitter memories of this unhappy time influenced much of his writings. Later, he was able to return to school, and after spending some time as an office boy, he became a journalist writing for various newspapers. He spent the formative period of his childhood and early youth in the dingy streets of London and gathered his impressions of human life from what was happening around him in that city. He got to know London extremely well, all its highways and passages, its squares and markets and gardens. Charles Dickens also came to know the shabby genteel life of the lower middle class sections of London population, which forms a large part of the world of Dickens's novels. In fact, the locale and happenings in his novels belong primarily to urban life, and most of the characters too are born and brought up in the city. In 1836, he married Catherine Hogarth and achieved early recognition the same year with Sketches by Boz, a collection of 56 short pieces concerning London life. It was published in monthly installments in a magazine. This was the genesis of the Pickwick Papers. It established Dickens's reputation as a great comic genius. Dickens's next literary triumph came with Oliver Twist. It realistically portrayed the unkind treatment of orphans in mid-19th century. The novel marked Dickens's foray into social fiction. While he was still working on Oliver Twist, Dickens began Nicholas Nickleby. His next two fictional endeavors, The Old Curiosity Shop and Barnaby Rudge, appeared in his weekly magazine. As he grew older, he worked harder than ever. Major works soon followed, including Dombey and Son, David Copperfield, A Tale of Two Cities, and Great Expectations. Dickens's penultimate novel was Our Mutual Friend. His life was full but exhausting, and on 9 July 1870, he died suddenly, having unfinished his last novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Dickens is buried in Westminster Abbey, London. His works have been both celebrated and criticized by scholars and readers. They have received praise for their striking realism, humorous note, moral vision, prose style, unforgettable characters, and socio-cultural commentary. On the other hand, the charge sheet framed against Dickens's works complains of loose episodic storylines, intellectual weakness, lack of psychological profundity, and sentimental extravaganza. Now, the characters in the novel: David Copperfield. Some major characters who have played an important role in the novel: David Copperfield, who is the chief protagonist of the novel. Mrs. Clara Copperfield is David's mother. Peggotty is Copperfield's servant. Daniel Peggotty is her brother. Ham Peggotty and Emily Peggotty are orphans adopted by Daniel Peggotty. Mr. Edward Murdstone is David's stepfather. Miss Jane Murdstone is Mr. Murdstone's sister. Mr. Barkis is a cart driver whom Peggotty marries later. Mr. Creakle is David's headmaster at boarding school. Tommy Traddles and James Steerforth are David's school friends. Mr. Micawber, an unsuccessful businessman, and Mrs. Micawber is his wife. Miss Betsy Trotwood is David's aunt. Mr. Dick is Miss Trotwood's companion. Mr. Wickfield is Miss Trotwood's lawyer. Agnes is Mr. Wickfield's daughter. Uriah Heep, Mr. Wickfield's assistant, and Mrs. Heep is Uriah's mother. Mr. Spenlow is a lawyer and Dora is his daughter. Miss Julia Mills is Dora's friend. Now, David Copperfield, a brief introduction. Dickens's eighth novel, the personal history, adventures, experience and observation of David Copperfield the Younger of Blunderstone Rookery, was serially published in monthly installment from May 1849 to November 1850. A one-volume edition of the novel followed in 1850 with the abbreviated title The Personal History of David Copperfield. Of all my books, Dickens wrote, I like this the best. Like many fond parents, I have in my heart of hearts a favorite child, and his name is David Copperfield. David Copperfield is the first of Dickens's novels written entirely in the first person, charting the life of the eponymous protagonist from childhood to maturity. Converting his autobiographical impulse into fiction allowed Dickens to explore uncomfortable truths about his life. David Copperfield's time at Murdstone and Grinby's warehouse, his schooling at Salem House, and his relationship with Dora all have their basis in Dickens's own life. It may be Dickens's most autobiographical novel, but David Copperfield is a work of fiction. An outline of the story of the novel. Dickens divides the life of David Copperfield into two distinct parts. The first, recounting the untimely loss of his innocence. In this orphan tale, Copperfield endures the hardships of his father's and then his mother's death and a wretched education at Salem House. The story is told in the first person by a middle-aged David Copperfield who is looking back on his life. David is born in Blunderstone, Suffolk, 6 months after the death of his father, and he is raised by his mother and her devoted housekeeper, Clara Peggotty. As a young child, he spends a few days with Peggotty at the home of her brother, Mr. Peggotty, in Yarmouth. When he was 8, his mother marries again. Her new husband, Mr. Edward Murdstone, is stern and cruel. And so is his disagreeable sister, the stony-faced Miss Jane Murdstone. Mr. Murdstone, a very controlling man, forces the principle of firmness on Clara. One day, Mr. Murdstone takes David to his bedroom and beats him. David bites his hand in return. After that, the 8-year-old David is sent to a miserable boarding school run by the stern and sadistic Mr. Creakle. There, David becomes friends with the kind and steadfast Tommy Treadles and the charismatic James Steerforth. His mother dies shortly after giving birth to a son, who also perishes. Peggotty is soon dismissed by Murdstones. She marries Barkis, who drives a wagon. David is not returned to school, and at the age of 10, he is sent to work at Murdstone's wine bottling factory in London. He stays at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, a generous couple who are constantly facing financial disaster. David develops a deep friendship with them. Mr. Micawber is unable to look after the household expenses and goes into debt. Eventually, Mr. Micawber is sent to debtor's prison, after which David runs away to Dover to find his great aunt Miss Betsy Trotwood. On the advice of her simple-minded and good-hearted companion, Mr. Dick, she takes him in. However, Miss Betsy has a rude encounter with Mr. Murdstone, who comes to take David. She refuses to hand over David to him and takes full care of him. Miss Betsy and Mr. Dick welcome David and pay for David to study law at Canterbury. Here, David rents a room in the house of a lawyer named Wickfield. David develops a sincere friendship with Wickfield's daughter Agnes, a sweet and good comforter. Working for Mr. Wickfield is a clerk named Uriah Heep, whom David dislikes. After graduation, David works in the law office of Spenlow and Jorkins and soon falls in love with Mr. Spenlow's daughter Dora. In the novel's second part, Copperfield establishes himself first as a legal clerk and parliamentary reporter and later as a novelist. At about this time, he goes to visit Peggotty. On the way to Yarmouth, David encounters Steerforth and together they visit Peggotty and Mr. Peggotty. Emily, the Peggotty's beloved niece, runs off to marry Steerforth, whom David had innocently introduced to her while she was engaged to Ham. Ham is a nephew of the Peggottys. Meanwhile, Miss Betsy has lost all her fortune due to Uriah Heep's scheming. David uses his spare time doing clerical and literary work to help Aunt Betsy, who now finds herself without financial resources. He marries Dora, only to find that he has a child wife who knows nothing of housekeeping and cannot accept any responsibility. In the meantime, Uriah Heep, the slippery and treacherous clerk in Mr. Wickfield's employ, whom David dislikes, as I told you earlier, has deceitfully worked his way into a partnership, taking advantage of Mr. Wickfield's weakness for wine. He is also attracted towards Agnes and wants to marry her. In addition, David also discovers that his old friend, Mr. Micawber, has been hired to work for Heep. To achieve his goal, Uriah Heep almost ruins Wickfield financially in hopes that he will submit and consent to the marriage. Eventually, however, Micawber has a grand moment of glory when he exposes Heep as a fraud, helping to save Mr. Wickfield and restoring some of Aunt Betsy's finances. Uriah Heep and Steerforth's servant are imprisoned, and Micawber's, Peggotty, Emily and Martha emigrate to Australia. David's wife, Dora, becomes ill and dies. The concluding chapters function as an epilogue to the first two parts. Copperfield now a famous novelist, takes his sufferings to Europe in a listless journey. It is only after he returns with renewed vigor that he realizes that Agnes Wickfield has been his true love all along, and their happy marriage takes place at last. This is the outline of the story in brief. In my next lecture on David Copperfield, I shall take up some important questions related to the novel. Thank you and have a nice day.